Today, we are extremely pleased to welcome Dr. Andrew Dawson. Andrew, you want to give us a bit of background on who you are and what you do, mate?
Great. Thanks, John. So, yes, I teach and research sport coaching at Victoria University, but I'm also a coach as well. So, like you, John, I coach in the area of track and field, but mostly with sprinters, although I sort of dabble in other areas as well. And my area of research interest is around sport coach development, and it's around coach learning and education from a sort of systems and organisational perspective, and to get a good understanding of how coaches engage in the learning process from a range of different perspectives. So whether it's coaches who are beginning the journey, and the mums and dads and what they do and how they get involved in coaching, right through to the high performance coaches and how they continually develop and evolve their knowledge and their practice. So that's the sort of stuff that I'm really interested in. And from a practitioner point of view, I'm eternally curious, like I think a lot of researchers and obviously people like you two as well. You're always wanting to learn more and learn how to get better, and so that's probably my key motivator or driver with not only the research but the way I teach and also then the way I coach. So that's
and how did you start off down this path? Like, I know that you had an involvement in sport, you're a pretty decent level sprinter yourself, and then but what made you actually want to understand the coaching process and those performance system structures? Like, did it evolve naturally, or was it something that you, from the start, you're like, I'm quite curious about where the success comes in this stuff?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, my very first foray into coaching was at the age of 12 because I was a reasonably successful sprinter in a small country town in Narrandera, so I was the fastest kid in town and made it right through to nationals and that type of thing. And I got approached by these 10-year-old kids coaching their basketball team. They wanted me to coach them. I knew nothing about basketball, but I could certainly get them to run fast from one end to the other. So that was my first go at it, and I did that for about 3 or 4 months. And obviously wasn't technically up to speed in basketball, but I really enjoyed the process, I think. And from then on, going through school, and then I think I was in year 12 and sports psychology was becoming a profession. We're talking here in the early 1980s, so it was only something that was really being talked about. So once I finished school, I got into PE and PE teaching, and they had a sports science stream, so I took that up as a sort of a major, and I did a minor in coaching. I did a minor in coaching and a minor in psych to sort of satisfy that curiosity. And part of that coaching minor is we had to then go and coach a squad of athletes, and this was at uni at Ballarat. And so I got a bunch of kids from Ballarat Grammar and coached them for a whole season. So that was my first squad, so to speak. And we did okay. We were pretty successful. And at that time I was competing. But I was an athlete that I was coached by a distance running coach. He was a former Olympic 5K runner, Tony Benson. And Tony was meticulous in his preparation. So training plans were just amazing, and everything was done ahead of time. And that really got me thinking, wow, this is
there's
really
a lot
amazing.
Going into this,
huge amount. But the other great thing about Tony was he was very much into, even though it was a squad of individual athletes, and so I was his only sprinter. I was training with all the middle and long distance runners, but it was a real team environment. And track and field athletes are usually very sort of solo types because they compete for themselves. But Tony set up this process of pretty much weekly we'd have, after a training, one night, like usually a Thursday night or whatever, there'd be some sort of social gathering around at his place. There'd be a barbecue or whatever. He was also our treatment professional because there was masseurs weren't that good, and he learnt how to do all that stuff himself. So we'd often just get there and get a massage, then we'd be hanging around for pizza or whatever, and his wife and kids and so on. So we're all part of that sort of family, that group, so that notion of team.
Well, I think this brings up a topic that I'm sure you can probably give us more info based on your research and your experience, but there seems to be a lot of elements related to coaching that I don't know that in the general public, there's a lot of understanding about the facets associated with that. We had this discussion the other day. I don't even remember who I was having the discussion with, but we were talking about the fact that, people think that coaching is programming, and programming is such a small aspect of that. And it sounds like obviously your experience was with Tony. He was very organized in terms of his planning and programming, but that's a small aspect of it. Building, as you said, those cultural factors, those systems, as you said.
Yes.
Is that something that you found in coaches that tend to have more success, or as they go on, they start to build more systems?
I think once they understand that you're not just treating a physiological system in an athlete, you're training the whole person, and you've got to know the interconnectedness with their family and their social group, and then within the dynamics within the group as well. And you're right, a really effective coach generally has a good sense or understanding of what that's like, and you see that in all the sports. Like the really successful AFL coaches are very much connected to that, and they're well known for their ability to do that. And I had a terrific mentor when I was working at Deakin Uni, David Parkin. So he sort of coaching.
He's really moved into that space, hasn't he, of coach education?
He's always been there. Yeah,
okay.
So he's been doing that for a long, long time, because he's trained as a primary teacher.
Yep.
So he understands pedagogy and learning.
Yeah, sorry to jump in. There seems to be a very strong link with coaching and teaching. Is that always been the case?
Yes.
And do you think that that's, in my mind, it seems like it's very common, because obviously one of the main aspects of coaching is teaching, whether it's physical skills or life skills or, structural things, tactics, whatever it may be. Do you think that there's a little bit lost at the moment in terms of marrying those two together?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Because we're, I think as human beings, we want to know more about the technical things, because it
seems like glamorous almost.
Well, it's almost like a magic pill. Can we find that thing that's going to make the big difference? You know what I mean? But in my eyes, sure, it may help, but having a new piece of equipment or a new bit of wearable technology, it's data that helps you make decisions more than anything. I think the key to any really successful coach is that relationship with the athlete on the one-on-one basis, but then with the broader group that they're working with, and understanding that. And I think that isn't taught very well, if at all, to be honest.
What aspects of it do you think need to be taught? And what effect does it have actually being good at being able to use those aspects?
I think probably in the early phases of coach education and development, and rightly so, you need to focus on the technical things of how to teach, the X's and O's, how to get a person from point A to point B in sprinting, for instance, and in the shortest possible time, and what are the technical elements that go into that. But to get the athlete coming back every session, it has to be an enjoyable experience for them. And if it's not, they're not going to show up, are they? So it's a bit like you guys in your practice. I mean, I probably don't think about physio treatment as being an enjoyable experience, but
the education side of it's massive. And like we spoke about this in a recent discussion with Richard Newsham-West of, he's on the education side, and we were talking about a lot of the aspects related to how you convey this message to patients, how your communication can be really valuable in terms of what you're saying and the way in which you're approaching it. And I know that we always talk about this, about the idea of, the iatrogenic effect or the nocebo effect that you get from poor communication. And we see it in sports performance all of the time. It can even be body language, like the way in which a coach communicates, the tone that they use, the way their voice is being portrayed really changes the way that's perceived. And these kind of things, I think, in more experienced coaches, from what I've seen, they're better and better and better at doing, but it's so subtle.
It is.
It is very, and Richard spoke about the idea of, the artistic side of healthcare, but I think this is the huge part of coaching that maybe doesn't get discussed, yet it's so high in terms of, its EQ side of things. And I don't think this is a controversial question, but I think it would be interesting to get your answer to this. Is what, in my mind, I think coaching is highly disrespected by a lot of other support professions around coaches, even in high performance settings. right?
Yep.
What do you think that is, given that a lot of these people actually are really well credentialed in lots of aspects, not only their coaching, but all of the areas around it?
I think, and I've got a great example here. I won't mention any names, but I had a PhD student who was basically, when I first started at VU, she was handed to me, and their particular project was around to do with the biomechanics of sprinting. And I said to them, well, and who have you spoken to? And they said, coaches. And I asked them straight away, well, what did they say? What do they think? And the first thing they did is they just rolled their eyes. This is the head, the biomechanists, and so on. They go, oh, God, bloody coaches, And I said, well, there's your problem right at the start. Yeah. And we said straight up, you're being very paternalistic. You know more than the coaches, don't you? They go, oh, yeah, we really do. And I said, well, that's the problem.
I read a paper that you co-authored. It was a qualitative...
Sorry. You're right.
That's right.
Repositioning.
Yeah.
It was a qualitative study you did looking at the relationships and beliefs between biomechanists and coaches.
Yeah. So that's Amy's PhD.
Yeah. And I actually found it quite interesting because there clearly was that disconnect from some of the findings where a lot of the biomechanists thought that the coaches didn't understand some of the main concepts around sprint mechanics. But then John and I were actually talking about this the other day of going, well, what knowledge do you need and what depth of knowledge do you need as a coach when you're thinking about translating knowledge to working with people? Because they're not writing a thesis here. No. They're working with people and they're working to try and essentially make them run faster in this situation. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts because it's something we often talk a lot about, that disconnect between researchers' application of research findings to real world. Where do you think that is and how do you think that needs to improve? And if so, how?
I think so, yes, definitely. I think the main barrier is that coaches won't read research journals.
I don't know. I dispute that. I think that
some do.
Well, interesting, I listened to a talk by Cliff Mallett, right, he works at University of Queensland, I believe.
Yep.
And he's a former high-level coach and also, sports psychology clinician and researcher. And he was sort of suggesting they did one of the papers, and they're even writing, I think, a book about this, serial winning coaches. They're saying the top coaches actually demonstrate similar behaviors. And one of them is what you talked about, that enduring curiosity. So they're often reading a lot. But interestingly, and it'd be interesting to see your aspects of this, he said that in some of the research that they did, it varied a lot from country to country. And I think one of the things that he made clear is in Australia, there is a strong attitude towards downplaying the intellectual side of coaching.
Yes.
Where it's, that's all bullshit. You just need to get out there and, you rev them up and get them onto the pitch sort of thing. Whereas in particularly Europe, maybe not as much North America, but particularly Europe, there is a very highly strong intellectual side of coaching. And to be a coach in, say, the national system, which a lot of those countries have national coaching systems, you actually have to have done a university degree in coaching.
You've got to have a master's, basically. Yeah.
And do you think that that's something that holds back particularly Australian coaching?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is. And, I did say broadly that coaches are not interested in doing looking at the research, but that is because they're not trained to understand the value of it. Yeah. I think, and that's
is that an Australian problem, or is that something you see more broadly across other countries as well?
It seems to have an Australian slant, and I think could that be culturally a distrust for authority, as well. That permeates through a lot of our stuff, I think. As Australians,
in Australian culture, there is that, isn't there?
Yeah. I think that's an important thing. And as you're saying, I spent a little bit of time in Poland back in 2018.
And that's completely different, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
It's a different world.
Every university there, it's just so well kitted out. They've got 4 institutes of sport, 2 winter and 2 summer. And so I was at one of their summer campuses in Spala. And I was there for their Olympic coaches conference. And I was just talking about leadership and some of the sort of those issues there. But a lot of the coaches, they're just really sophisticated, knowledgeable people. And I was chatting to Peter, who invited me over, And I said, what's the level of education for coaches there? And he said, everyone on a national team has to have a minimum of a master's in coaching or sports science to even walk in the door. But that's, and it's also in their professional system as well, which is less common in the professional sports from a coach's point of view. The other practitioners definitely, but
do you think that is reflected in their the success that they get?
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
In what way?
Yeah, I was going to say, because what do you think it is about going through that formal process of?
I think one of the things we don't teach terribly well in Australia, and this is it's my perspective from a university point of view as well, is we teach the sports science technical stuff of how to become a good practitioner and so on, but I don't think we teach the principles underlying it terribly well.
Yeah, this is a common theme that we come back to, the principles.
Exactly.
And what are some of those things? What are some of those principles that you think are missing typically in that sort of sports performance and sports science realm?
Look, I think knowing and understanding the psychological and the social components of coaching.
Yeah.
That just...
Have you seen much of John Kiley's work?
No.
Oh, you'd love it.
Yep.
So John Kiley's sports performance, sports science research. I think he's at is he at Central Lancashire at the moment?
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head.
Yeah.
I think but he's worked with the English Institute of Sport and UK athletics and rugby and all those things. He's an Irish researcher and practitioner, but I think his paper I started noticing in the late 2000s, so 2008, something around there. He started publishing with stuff about periodization and how so much of it is based on incomplete research and methodologies, but also the main reason that he was seeing major flaws in it is that it discounted the psychological component. And a big thing that he started to really develop further of the same concept is the idea of how much belief has in someone's response to a program. So, as I said, if an athlete is in an environment that they're enjoying, they have faith in what the program is and the people around them, then the results are better, even if the program is exactly the same, but they're in a different environment. And now we're starting to look at the sort of neurobiological concept of predictive coding and how a lot of our behaviors are heavily based on our perception of reality rather than the objective reality. And, a silly example I believe he gave in a podcast, but I think it makes sense to everyone, is our physiological response will match what we perceive. So the example that he gave was, if you're walking, say, along a bush track and you hear a noise and you look up ahead and you see something that looks like a snake, right? You will get a response, your heart rate will rise, you get an adrenal response, even though the objective reality is what you see up ahead that's long and thin is a stick, right? So your prediction about what you're perceiving is different compared to what the objective reality is. And I think what you're saying matches a lot of this stuff because it's really important to understand, as you said, how is that individual fitting within that environment, both socially and psychologically, and then what effect does that have?
Yep.
And I think those are some of the interesting areas in which good coaches, I mentioned before, get right because they sort of perceive that whole picture.
Well, they may also just from life experience understand it as well.
Yes.
And I think that's an important part of that. But, I've been involved in, coach education programs in sport organisations as well and their development, and they don't bring that stuff in until a level 3 or higher.
Yes.
When really they should be learning that right from the word go.
And is that some of that, as you said, pedagogical understanding?
It's a crowded curriculum, I think. That's the thing, because they want them to get to the technical stuff first, how to run fast in a straight line or, how to hit a golf ball better and all of that sort of stuff. They see that as the priority first.
What do you think would happen if they went the other way and they said, all right, we're going to give you skills to teach people and communicate and create good environments first, then we'll teach you the nuts and bolts of that sport?
Look, I think they're attempting to do that now with the new programs that are coming online through Sport Australia, but again, they're so general and broad that I think a lot of people miss the point. if you know what I
I
mean.
reckon it's like a key problem that we're seeing even in like education. I think in Australia, we were probably a little bit slower than most countries to go down the path of undergraduate, postgraduate, and understanding that process is not being put in to slow you down into getting into your career progression. It's because developing knowledge takes more time than what most young people are willing to be patient around.
And you can even probably relate that to your own experience.
Oh, of course. Everything always takes, 3 times longer than what you probably initially perceive.
Yeah.
And we always talk about this concept of, particularly with knowledge, that there's almost a minimum amount of time that you need it to marinate for, and depends on how slow you are. I think I'm a bit slower than most. It takes longer to marinate, but
well, I'm interested. This question probably for both of you, both being coaches and having exposure to lots of different coaches, is when you look at, say, coaches in an elite setting versus a non-elite, or say sub-elite. In terms of the actual knowledge of and skill set related to that sport, do you see a big difference, or do you think it's more related to other factors associated with their coaching?
There's been a bit of research that looks at that, and the difference between a sort of a novice coach and an elite coach. We did some research on swimming coaches a while ago.
Yeah, we'll get into this because Andrew's got some really good insights into swimming, and obviously swimming's had a lot of success, particularly last Olympics. And I think we might go down that path because I actually got to see a pretty interesting thing, which I'll share. But keep going.
Good. And one of the things they found was that when they were looking at so they got 3 different swimmers at, so 3 different levels. So a beginner, a beginning competitor, an intermediate, and an elite competitor, and they got them to swim. It was like 20 metres or whatever. It was just the freestyle, I think, from memory. And they got the novice coach to look at all 3 levels and to sort of pick the technical things they need to work on. They did the intermediate coach, the same sort of thing, and then the elite coach. And obviously the elite coach was able to pick up the elite athlete stuff and the intermediate very well, but they completely missed the technical things for the novice.
Yeah, okay.
And then the other way around, the intermediate coach was able to do quite well on both, but the novice coach wasn't very good at picking up the intermediate technical things to focus on, or the elite coach. And it's a very small sample as well. Sure. But we did the same thing with one of my PhD students earlier on the tennis serve. We just repeated that same model. I said, because she was interested in, how do we upskill the tennis serve, the coaching of the tennis serve. And I said, oh, funny, we did a methodology on this about 10 years ago at Deakin. Why don't we replicate that? And she did. And she was able to then create a whole online learning program based on what we call decision chains in terms of decisions to make when you view something, as to the flow of decision-making around the types of things you correct.
And what was the decision chain?
It's quite long. I think I'll send you the paper.
No, explain it.
Well,
time. We're not in a rush.
Yeah, well, and Eula would be explaining it better, so I'll completely stuff this up.
That's right. But, we'll find the paper to get the in-depth explanation.
Right. So pretty much it was looking at what is the technical model that the coach brings into it. So we had to examine what that was first from the beginner, the intermediate, and so what was their technical model? How did that match what was considered the technical model from the biomechanical analysis? So did they actually learn or understand that to start with? And then when the person was doing the serve, what were they actually looking for that was important from the mistake or the error they were making in order to then make the right corrective intervention to fix that up.
So essentially they had their technical system and that sort of followed on with what they were observing and then what they were going to correct.
Yes, that's right. And so it helped them then make those decisions around, we'll ignore that bit because that's the bit that's really important here that's missing.
It's the primary driver, really.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah. Okay. And again, there was differences between the beginners and the
that was the question I was going to ask is, was there a much clearer, decision tree that the experienced coach was going through?
I think, yes, the experienced coach, but again, they missed out on the novice stuff again. So it was a similar sort of pattern to the swimming coach. Now, that could be because the methodology we used was the same and it just produced the same results. But it was fairly clear that the coach, the more elite coach, had a much more sophisticated decision chain and set of decisions to make.
Here's the question for you then. What do you think led to them not being able to have much effect on the beginner? Because in my mind as a coach, I would think that there would be fundamental movement patterns, for instance, with a tennis serve. I think to running, and I look at a young kid and I look at an elite. I don't see that what I'm looking at, although they can't do the same things, is different.
Yep.
So what do you guys sort of apportion that to?
Look, I can't remember if we actually talked about that in the thesis. It was more to do with just the.
Well, what's your?
Well, my take here on it is that that the elite coach is looking for things that just aren't there with the beginner at the moment, because they just don't have either the strength or the coordination or whatever to actually perform the tasks in a way that's appropriate. So if they went back to try and teach that, the kid probably just isn't going to get it, and it's just too hard for them. I think I see that a bit in some of because as I said, I coach juniors, and I've tried to at times apply a sort of senior coaching model to them, and it just doesn't work.
Yeah, you've got to. It's interesting you say that, because I know that I can't remember exactly which European country it is, but essentially they talk about the fact that their best coaches, I think it might actually be in Charlie Francis's book, controversial or not, but it's a good read. He's saying that in Poland, when it was Jared Mark, wasn't it?
That was his, yep.
Spoke about the fact that when you're there, the best coaches don't coach necessarily the elites. They coach the development groups because they want to give the best coaching to the people on the way through.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's interesting you say that some of those elite coaches that you've taken from these studies actually probably may not have had as much effect on those development pathways.
And it depends and that's the question we didn't ask, where did you come from?
Yes.
So were you an elite tennis player? So you already have that, you know what you're looking for, because you've always been watching the person at the other end serving at you and you're thinking, shit, they've got a rocket serve, and you pick that up straight away. Whereas trying to teach a junior how to do that stuff is just virtually impossible. So there's those sort of things as well.
That makes me think straight away, because we see this example in healthcare all the time, and I think it happens in coaching a lot. I've noticed it quite a bit, is people want to jump straight to working with elites, because obviously there's notoriety associated with, I work for an elite sporting team.
Prestige.
Or, do you think that that's actually a big problem that we see in sports coaching and sports coaching development, is that people, one, that potentially they can even access it earlier than they should, and two, do you think that slows their development along the way? I remember hearing someone talk about, and I don't remember who it is, so I apologize, but I remember someone talking about, say, with swimming in the US compared to track and field, our sport, where in track and field, if you were a decent previous athlete, you just start coaching and other elites might be attracted to working with you. Whereas in swimming, someone gave the example that, Phelps couldn't even coach kids or he would have to start coaching kids because their system in the US is you don't start here. You start at the bottom and you have to earn your coaching credentials.
Yeah, and that happens in swimming in Australia as well. Yeah. So that's a very strict sort of license process. Whereas you can have an elite athlete, and just because they've made a national team, and I'm not sure if the policy is still the same, but they automatically got their level 1 certification without having to do anything. So that from the start was very, very problematic.
Yeah.
But it's just, I think we assume that because they're an elite athlete that they actually know how to coach, and they know all the technical things, when, history in sport is riven with elite athletes being parachuted into senior coaching roles and completely screwing things up.
Well, this is an interesting discussion, because, we spoke about it the other day, and there's lots of programs that do this. I know the AAS pushes this. I know that's happening in our sport. Athletes who have had some success, whether they've made national teams, whatever, as you said, get parachuted in. What about that? You mentioned it could be problematic. What about it do you think is problematic? Because on the surface, you look at, say, AFL, all of the coaches have an AFL background. The one time of recent that happened where someone didn't, where you had Bolton, everyone kept criticising, saying, oh, well, the guy's never played at the level. He doesn't know what's going on. Do you see that attitude is holding back actually coaching development?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And probably the key problem is that, and, I don't decry any elite athlete that's worked very hard and is hoping for a career in coaching, and good luck to them. And I think it's fantastic that they're putting their hand up and wanting to have a go.
Because they bring a unique experience
absolutely.
to the role, yeah.
And I think that's incredibly valuable. But for those who are wanting to support and develop them, they need to make sure that they understand pedagogy, for starters. That's the first thing. How do people learn? Because that's what we do. We teach all day, every day. The term coach comes from in England back in the days when there was one of the pandemics that was happening over there. It was pretty much the wealthy families were sending their teachers from one place to another in a coach. So the teacher resided in the coach.
Yep.
And so coaches are teachers. So knowing and understanding that from the very beginning. And that's why good teachers are really good coaches.
Yeah, that's interesting you say that, because that makes sense. That's a good historical kind of reference point.
Yeah. So if you've got an elite athlete that comes in, but they don't understand pedagogy, for starters, they're going to really struggle. If they don't understand some of the fundamental principles in the sport sciences, so your physiology, biomechanics, motor learning, psychology, they're going to struggle. Because when they're really put under pressure, they're going to make some poor decisions potentially. They won't always, but unless they have that. So I think they're probably the 5 things they need to have in order to do well. And then you've got all the other coaching specific stuff around the planning and the engagement side of things, and also then knowing how to interact, manage up, manage down, sideways, working in an environment, a club environment, for instance. We're both at the same club, and there's all sorts of funny politics that goes on there, and I've got myself sucked into some stuff sometimes that I thought I really should have not been involved in. But anyway, that's the nature of coaching. But yes, those things I think are really, really important. Now, an elite athlete will have some understanding of that, but they only have it from the athlete's perspective. They don't have it from an administrator's perspective. They know nothing around what goes on in boards. And, boards are making the big, hairy decisions that can have a big impact, not just on the elite group that they are quite often having to make decisions on funding with, but that flows then down to filters through to the whole system.
Yeah, I've actually noticed this quite a bit, now that I'm lucky enough to be involved a little bit at a higher level, and I'm speaking more with people who are making decisions around things like selections for relay teams and all that kind of thing. It's really interesting seeing that side of it versus the athlete side of it. The athletes think, oh, they're just blocking me. And what they often don't understand is the people in the middle, say the team relay coach, whatever, they're getting information from selectors, from the high performance, from the head coach. Then they're obviously getting information from the coaches who coach those athletes in that group, and they're having to make a decision that's being influenced from lots of different levels. And I don't think it's been announced yet, but the Commonwealth Games Squad, for instance, I know for a fact that the way in which it's being selected is based on what the selectors want, right? Which is always going to be the case, but there's potentially coaches in the program from AA who actually wanted different outcomes. And that's interesting for me to see that just because you take that role of being the coach, as you said, you're in the middle. You're not necessarily making all of the decisions about selection. And I know that you hear this as the professionalization, say AFL and things happening. The head coach is not necessarily the person making all decisions like they used to, say, maybe 15, 20 years ago. They're sitting, as you said, in between where...
Well, they're part of a committee.
Yeah. And some of those decisions are not their decisions to necessarily make, but the athlete sees it from, the coach didn't pick me. And it's like, well, it wasn't even the coach that made
in
that
those
decision.
team environments, basically the coaches and from what I hear and what I observe and chatting to people, is that they're pretty much their main responsibility is what happens on the training track, and then on game day, then they have to take a back seat and let others have input. Doesn't mean they don't have an influence over things, but their role changes quite a bit.
Yeah, okay.
And so depending on the power of the coach, so someone like Alistair Clarkson, for instance, who everyone wants to be the next coach of their club, he comes in with a huge amount of say in things, whereas a new coach coming into the system won't. It really depends on the sort of the dynamics that are going on within the organisation in that time.
Well, I was actually interested when you were talking before about, say, track and field selection. I would have thought in a sport like that, where you can be very objective about who's the best and who's not, as opposed to, say, a team sport where there are some qualitative or subjective assessments to the performance of the player.
Yeah, it's not that simple. So, for instance, even at the moment, and I know that there's some controversy around it, we'll see how it actually plays out because it hasn't happened yet. But say, for instance, in the women's 1,500 metres, there's 4 of them that have qualified, and the selection policy, and they can only take 3. The selection policy is one where the person who wins national and has qualified is automatically selected, but that person at the moment, Abby Caldwell, is the slowest out of the 4. Right? So what do they do?
Yeah,
and I'm not saying they should do anything. I don't know. It's not my position to say, but I understand that for the selectors, that's real difficult because they create a selection policy that says that she should be the first person picked, but actually based on her performance and her consistent performance, she's going to perform the worst or has the potential to perform the lowest in terms of where she finishes in the field.
And historically, we've seen that play out ending up in courts.
Yeah, it goes to court of arbitration.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Cycling had happened many years ago with Kathy Watt, I think. Same sort of scenario. She was selected and then for whatever reason, so they said, no, you can't. So it became a very public fight.
Yeah.
And so she ended up back in the squad, and I think to her credit, she ended up winning a gold medal or something like that. So there are, and look, I could be completely wrong there, and this is my very foggy memory in relation to this, but these things do have, and when you're talking about teams especially, in an individual sport, when they'll take typically 6 to take 6 people in
this year, for instance, and I know this is one of the things that it's been difficult for them. We've got the World Championships and the Commonwealth Games basically back to back. It doesn't happen; it's happened because of COVID, right? But even in the Commonwealth Games year, and another example would be Commonwealth Games and European Championships typically overlap, right? So they're usually in the same year. For a European athlete, say like a British athlete, they want to go to European Championships more than they want to go to the Commonwealth Games because the prestige is greater. So for athletes who are going to do both, there becomes problems. And so if I use that example, you've got this issue where, although, you might take 6, some of them, if they do the European Champs first, or the Commonwealth Games, then they're sore or they've got an injury, then you've got people coming in and out. But you've got to name these teams before it happens because you've obviously got to have people in the right place. You've got to make sure you've got reserves, you've got this, you've got that.
And there's the administrative accreditation issues.
Yeah, you've got to get, if it's a village or whatever, you've got to get people in. So it becomes a real problem. And it sounds like, it should be straightforward, but it never is.
I think individual sports, it's relatively less of an issue. Mind you, if you've only got 1 or 2 people qualified and they're still performing okay, that's fine. That's not an issue. But when like you're talking about the 1,500 there, that's a tough decision. I'm glad it's not me making.
I think this makes me think about the concept, and I know it relates to your PhD research, of it seems like as you go in towards more elite sport, you need skills that come much more from business and from management, and sports psychology and all of those things, because you're dealing with people and you're dealing with management issues. And the more you say these things, particularly say if we're looking at an AFL kind of, a professional position there, to me, it almost seems like you've taken a CEO role almost.
You are. Yeah.
Right? You sit between the board and then the plan. And obviously I know at AFL clubs they have a CEO of the whole club because it's more of the financial side. But your research looked at, okay, well, what can we take from other professions and how does it relate and how do those skills interact?
Yep.
Do you think that there's going to be more and more of this occurring where you're needing skills from other professions? If so, what are they? And do you think that hopefully at some level will maybe start to increase the respect of what's required in coaching?
I think further up the performance pathway, coaches need to have a good understanding of the business side of things financially, because that's often keeps them awake at night. Where am I going to get the money to do this? How am I going to generate the funding and the capacity to actually do what we need to do? So coaching high performance athletes is an expensive business.
Yep.
When you think about travel and all the treatment that they get, and feeding them and all of that type of thing. So understanding how to have that from a financial perspective and what something will just cost, the cost of a program. So it's not unusual. They really need to develop some of those small business skills, I think. Very, very important. So understanding that. The other thing is really developing some political savviness. So really understanding how their role or their spot within an organisation, and especially as they move to those higher levels of performance, is understanding, who do you interact with, how do you get involved in the decision making that's going to affect the things that affect you on a day-to-day basis. And that's why I always encourage coaches, look, if you've got an opportunity to get into the club board or their committee somehow, do so, because you can obviously, it might be a selfish thing to do. I just want more money and more space and more capacity
You've got to become
for
a
my squad.
it sounds like.
You do. You literally do. You've really got to advocate for yourself and your squad and your people. That's pretty much what you've got to do. But if you zoom out a little bit more and you think about, well, how does this, if you start chatting to the other people, within the club and saying, well, what do you need? And quite often it's the exact same thing. It's not always, but the things that they need. So, you've got to actually develop that capacity to speak up and to say, look, what we need to do in order to make our club work and our athletes work and keep our coaches happy are these things. And so developing those political advocacy skills are really, really important, and developing those, and their leadership skills, really, if you think about it.
Do you think this makes me think, because obviously I always think about this concept that as you go up the chain of coaching, you become less of a day-to-day coach. Do you think that this starts to push towards a role that's not actually a day-to-day coach, but you are someone who's more in the management of coaches? Do you think we'll see more and more? We are already seeing these roles come online, but do you think we'll see more and more of this happening?
Yep, definitely. Well, the EPL is an example of that. They don't call the coach, they call them the manager.
Yeah.
And the day-to-day operational stuff of coaching happens by their assistant coaches.
Yes.
Seeing it in the AFL, they're still called the senior coach, but really the nuts and bolts of the coaching happens with the assistant coaches. And then obviously the senior coach puts on his bench coaching hat, during competition, but he'll oversee the running of practice, because, if you go to an AFL coaching or an AFL training session, you'll see the senior coach out there doing some things, but a lot of the time it's a he at the moment. But even in the women's coaching side of things, it's the assistant coaches who do the bulk of the technical work. But when you chat to the coaches, what do you enjoy doing the most? They still love doing the on-the-ground day-to-day stuff.
I always think about that, because it seems like in terms of longevity and even career progression, you want to work towards the higher paying roles. But it's actually probably not what most coaches would like to be doing. They don't want to be managers necessarily. Some might enjoy it, but they don't necessarily want to do that unless they're someone who has that more bigger thinking, strategic kind of mindset. Do you think that that's a limitation for, the profession of coaching?
It's a limitation, I think, more around how coaches are supported, because they just want the space to be able to go out and coach. And when they're constantly being drawn into, senior coaches, especially media and marketing and business decision and management decision operations, it takes them away from getting out and solving the problems, which is what they love to do, and to help athletes perform better. But, obviously taking on those senior roles is something they aspire to because they think they're the one that's going to make a difference.
Yeah.
I
guess the opportunity to make more difference is probably there because you're going to have effect on more people and the overall system or structure.
Yep.
More so than what you will in regards to, individual athletes, because you can't coach 500 athletes, but you could be in charge of the organization that has 500 athletes as part of that club or system.
Yeah, and swimming's this example we're going to get to.
Yeah, it's a perfect segue. What I was going to ask you is, we've seen a transformation in swimming, probably since, when was the Steel Knox thing?
That was in London.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that was a disaster, and they tipped the whole joint upside down, basically. And I know that you've had a big influence, or at least a big insight into what's happened there. And I was lucky enough, and I'll share it, maybe after you've given us some background, but to see an experience in Tokyo that really, to me, cemented an understanding of why they had so much success. And I know it's an area of interest for you, but it seems like they made a really big shift culturally in what they were trying to do. How do you think your experiences with swimming have been demonstrated through that, not only the coach development pathway, but what you've observed in terms of the organisational change?
Yep. Well, just a bit of background around swimming. We won the tender to sort of modernise their development and their high performance coaching programs.
Yep.
And turn it into a 20th century type of or 21st century version, I should say, not 20th century. My role was they gave me a curriculum, and so I turned it into an online learning, blended learning program, and we developed the content for the courses in collaboration with senior coaches. And so I'd already known Rowan. We're going to talk about Rowan Taylor, but I'd known Rowan years ago because he was going to be a master's student of mine when I was a deacon. But I think he just got a bit busy and so on. So once I came on board with the development of the project, part of the role was to, I was writing the content, but I wanted to make sure that it was actually what coaches wanted and what they thought was important, but also to stick to the fundamental principles of pedagogy and all the sports sciences to make sure that they were getting that stuff as part of their training. And so a lot of the modules or units had to go past a committee of senior coaches in terms of, is it relevant? Does it actually meet the stuff that they think is important for that level of coaching? So we were able to do that. And I had the good fortune of connecting with Rowan and Lee Nugent. And these two guys at that stage, were in charge of coach development across pretty much eastern and southern Australia. So they were can't remember I think they were like coaching mentors. Yep. At that stage, Rowan was still coaching a squad of athletes. I don't think Lee was by that stage. But they were instrumental in setting up a really good system of engagement with all of the coaches at that sort of development level and high performance level and interacting with them. So they based themselves at the VIS, and they'd either travel to, rather than asking the coaches to come in and do workshops, they would just jump in their car or jump on a plane and go out and spend time with the coaches, watching them, spending a week with them, and just helping them develop. And so that system worked really well. So it was a really good quality mentoring system.
Do you think that that's really important, like actually going into their space and being the fly on the wall, but then starting to give the feedback that they needed and asking questions and start to push them on, okay, where do we need to develop further? Why do you think that works better than bringing them in?
Because you, as an educator and mentor and developer, understand that coach's context very, very clearly. You can see.
I see this as a really big issue, I think, with all professional development, is it's you come to us rather than we go to you. And I think that that's really to me, it's really interesting because I think, as you said, you don't really understand how someone operates until you're in their space, and you get the contextual side of things. So it's interesting you say that was really successful for them to kind of implement.
Oh, absolutely. And they also then brought in Jaakko Verheerenen, who was the apologies, Jaakko, for mispronouncing your name. After, I think that was after the whole Still Knox thing. So he came in, I think, in 2015, just prior to Rio, and changed the policy around selection, because prior to Rio, the selection was like an AA. You had to win at your national championship, and then that automatically got you on the team. But it was often 3 or 4 months between national championship, which was typically in March, and the elite competition, which was in August or September or whatever. So athletes can really
go
fall
all over
off.
the place, get injured, get sick.
So Jaakko basically said, no, our national championships and selection is always 6 weeks prior to the big event.
So I think this is one of the massive issues that athletics faces in Australia, and it's really a frustration that I have that they've done it a few times for major championships. I know they did it, say, in 2000. They did the trials. I think it was only about a month out or 6 weeks out. I think that they should do the same thing here. And we have in the northern states the opportunity to do so, yet we still choose to do our nationals. And I'm not saying you don't have nationals. You might have nationals, but the actual selection trials are not nationals.
I think they should have, this is me being a little bit controversial, nationals for underage.
Yep.
Senior nationals 6 weeks out from big comps.
Yes. Yep.
And that way then that I think will
you have an
save
idea
a lot.
of.
And look, you could still have some GP events and so on in that March period there to just sort of see where people are at. And because it's fun, because the kids love to see the senior athletes competing and things like that, and I think that's a really good thing.
Well, I guess you could even coincide the junior nationals with a Grand Prix meeting, say if it's in Sydney, well,
they've done that,
and they've done it before, where the junior nationals has been, and then they've put the Sydney Track Classic, the Saturday night, and they've put the events on. They could do exactly the same thing.
Yeah, no, that's just me and my little opinion.
No, I agree with you. I think that would actually really enhance the opportunity for athletes to develop the readiness at the right time of the year, and I think it would help coaches a lot.
Oh, planning that stuff just makes it so much easier, I would imagine.
What were you going to ask you?
Yeah, well, I was interested to hear your thoughts. Have you ever thought about how you've obviously had a lot of involvement from having athletes work on the rehab side or working in sports medicine groups? Do you think for physios, sports docs, people working on that rehab side, there are skills and knowledge we can take from coaching theory or knowledge to help enhance what we do? Have you ever thought about that?
The short answer is yes.
Yeah, definitely.
I can tell you.
We'll get to your thoughts in a moment, John.
Well, it ultimately comes back to the coach-athlete relationship, and it's the same thing. When you're really good rehab outcomes come when the client really connects with the practitioner in a lot of ways, because the best program is looks fantastic on paper, but if the client walks out the door and throws that program in the bin, it's pointless, isn't it?
John and I often laugh about this, and we get physio students coming in here to do placements, and I often think they must get a bit of a laugh sometimes at hearing some of the conversations we have out here with some of the patients or clients we're working with or in the rooms, where obviously there's a time and a place to be professional, where you understand what's going on with the patient, you have a clear structure and plan that you've discussed with them. But once all that's in place and they have confidence in you, you can treat them like a normal human being.
Yeah, exactly.
As opposed to, the issue of is that painful? Nobody stops.
Overly professionalize the interaction.
Absolutely.
But once you build that trust and they come in, the first thing you say to them is, you're not saying, how's the leg going? You're saying, hey, how's your day been? And it's that connection, that human connection.
Yeah.
And they feel relaxed all of a sudden. They feel safe and all of that sort of stuff about, sure, it's going to be a hard sesh today because we're going to be doing, Pilates and, or whatever, and it's going to kill me. But they know that you've got their best interests at heart and you're really interested and curious about them as a human being. And I think that just makes such a difference.
Well, that's it. And a part of it is not just them developing trust in your professional ability, but also just having a good relationship with them.
Yep.
And knowing that, also more importantly too, is once you start to break down some of those barriers, there's an opportunity to understand other psychological, social factors going on with that person that's associated with their problem. So, you learn a bit about their family, or they're currently in a relationship, or they recently broke up with someone where, depending on the formality of the relationship, they may not be willing to give that information to you, even though it has a lot of relevance to how they're responding in their rehabilitation process, because they may be going or experiencing a lot of psychological or emotional stress.
Good paper to read by Mark Anderson and Jean Williams around stress and rehab outcomes in sports psych. I don't know if you've seen that, but sort of mid-1990s or thereabouts. Fantastic stuff. And the reason I say Mark, because he was my sports psych supervisor.
Okay.
And whenever we did a session, he'd ask me the first question. And he called me Andre, said, "Do you like your client?" I said, "What? What do you mean, do I like them?" "That's not right." He said, "Yes, it is. Because if you don't get on well with them, you're really not going to be much of a practitioner for them."
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, and how do you think that then works in coaching? Because in some settings, obviously, you get to choose who your athletes or the athletes that come into your program. But in, say, like a professional setting, you may not even be necessarily the person who goes down and does the recruitment. Now, you might have a say, but typically you might not necessarily get a lot to do with that person's personality or anything like that. I think we're seeing this play out at the moment with this Jordan DeGoey thing, right? How does this interplay, the question you just asked, fit into, a professional setting where it's like, what do? Do you get them to step off the bus? It's like, all right, you're no longer part of this?
Sometimes. I remember when I was with a women's basketball team, and again, formative experience working and getting, sort of developing my skills in the sports psych side of things. There was a real push by one of the players on the team to get rid of the coach. And we didn't really understand what was going on. But, I started just chatting, and I'd obviously built some trust with some of the other girls in the team. I said, "Oh, no, this girl's boyfriend is a coach. He wants to coach our team." And so that was, I thought, oh, okay. So I fed this back to the coach, and I said, "Oh," and so 2 days later, she was gone.
They just got rid of it.
Yeah, because she was causing such a disruption to the whole team and undermining the coach's capacity to, and she was a really good player, like one of the best.
I think that's one of the most interesting things. And I know, like, we obviously didn't finish the stuff on swimming. Like, do you think that some of those things really do influence the cultural side of a sporting organisation or a team when, key values and principles are withheld? Is that something that, I don't know if you have insight from swimming or from other sports, but is that something that you think is really, really important?
Oh, for sure. I think, and not everyone's going to totally subscribe to the mission and so on. And people come into a team for a range of reasons.
Yeah, different reasons sometimes.
And they want to get different things out of being part of the group. I think the hard part from a coach's point of view is to be able to sort of determine, well, what's their real motive here? Are they actually helping us as a group to sort of stay together, or is there going to be potential for conflict?
It's interesting you say this. I've been reading a few different books recently, and one of the things that I asked my group actually just the other day, and a lot of them looked at me as if I was going crazy, but I actually said, what is your role within this group? And another question was, what is your contribution to the group? And also what's the contribution of the group to you? But I think a lot of them maybe have never thought of, okay, well, what do I actually contribute? I probably take things from the group. I get whatever it is, sports performance stuff, and I get, interaction with people I like. But what am I actually giving back? And I think as a coach, and even it's probably the same in business and in management, if you're thinking about the people who are in your team, okay, well, what is their contribution? And if it's negative, as you're saying, when someone's actually disrupting and they're not giving much positive back, well, maybe they're not the right person to be in that team. And you do need to remove them from that environment.
Yeah. And it's sometimes hard to tell at the outset. I mean, I've been on recruitment committees at universities, and universities are rife with people who are really hard to live and work with. I mean,
Jack knows about this.
It's to be successful at the university, you've got to have a very robust ego to start with, and also
know how to play the game. And you're almost Machiavellian in your approach. If you want to reach the top and get there quickly, there's some people do some really unbelievable things to get there, but and that's not my bag at all. I'm quite happy doing what I do. And enjoy the process and so on. But, just finding, and when you were telling your story and chatting to your group, I have the similar conversations with my guys, probably not as a whole group, but just certain individuals, because you spend a lot of time in cars travelling, especially to pro meets and stuff like that. And you've got, maybe one or two team members in there, and we start talking about different people and things like that. It's always fun conversations.
It's interesting, I think, sometimes to see, because people are intuitive, even when you maybe perceive that they're not paying attention, but it's interesting to get an idea of what other people perceive of different members of the group and what they're doing as part of that group.
And some people are switched on, and really they pay attention to everything.
And you don't even realise that they're paying so much attention.
No, I've got one in my group, and someone that you'll probably know, he's an absolute character. But he's come into my group and he's sort of spent time in others and hasn't lasted long there just because of his personality, I think. But they haven't really understood him as a person. And then I've now chatted to other people in the group and said, what do you think about, such and such being in the group? And I said, at the start, he's an absolute pain in the ass. And I said, what do you think now? He said, he's like the heart and soul of the place. He just makes us want to do more because he's constantly texting us and telling us and harassing us and so on. I said, he's made my job a hell of a lot easier to get you guys
That's the thing,
involved.
Like, if you think about someone like his role in the group in some ways, without necessarily taking on it, he's the motivator or he's the organizer.
Yeah.
And for you, that's probably a good thing.
It is. I mean, I'm having to sort of constantly manage him and around that. And, there have been times, some stuff on WhatsApp. I said, don't forget, we've got some juniors in the group here. Just be a bit tame with the stuff you put on there. And he goes, good call, thanks, coach. And so that's good. So that I see as really valuable. But I getting back to the overall group, some people just pay absolutely no attention to it because of what else is going on in their lives at the time, or they're just not interested. They just want to show up to training, do their thing, and bugger off.
I think, because I've been thinking about this concept of, is that okay? Is it enough to just turn up and take and not give back? Right? Because in my mind, and I might be wrong, but I always think that success is going to come when everyone contributes at least something.
Yeah.
So if you're contributing little and taking a lot, I don't know that it's almost like that freeloader kind of example.
It is tough, and there's been a couple of people I've recognised that, so I've just given them a little role. I said, to really help if you can do this.
Yeah.
And they've gone, yeah, sure, okay, I'll do that.
Yeah.
And it's only because I've asked them to do it, and they're quite happy to do it.
Yeah.
So it seems about just finding what's important for them, and sometimes you don't know. It's just hard because they're just not very giving, or they're just very private, or who knows. There's a whole range of reasons. But I try and look for something as much as possible for a way for them to contribute in whatever way. I've got another athlete who's really into Olympic lifting and so on. It's been his thing, former competitor. And I said, what do you think about taking on the role of being our head of Olympic lifting for our senior guys? Yeah. He goes, oh, yeah, I'd love to do that. Fantastic.
Yeah.
He's all of a sudden changed his attitude to training, and now he's right into it, and he's really doing that. So it's about finding what they're into, and if it's something that they can then contribute back to the group, then that works really well. Yeah. So that's me sort of doing that sort of more executive level of looking at and managing the people in the group, And it wasn't a deliberate thing. It just occurred to me after, waking up at 3 a.m. when all your best ideas come out at 3 and 4 in the morning. Thinking,
and some of the stupid ones.
Yeah, a lot of really stupid ones.
When you wake up in the morning, you go, oh, that was a dumb idea.
Yeah.
I was like, must have been half asleep with that one.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, I think what I think of straight away when you talk about group dynamics is how those behaviours and interactions actually affect the adaptation and improvement in the individual. And like even how group dynamics will affect how someone feels in the day and how that actually affects their physical output capacity. Because very rarely you're going to get the lone wolf who just got their headphones in all the time. They can
I think unfortunately there are a lot of athletes, especially in our sport, who think they're going to make it on their own. And it's just not possible.
No.
I don't think anyone has success on their own. Doesn't matter who you are. And those stories of, I did it myself and the self-made person, it's bullshit.
Yeah.
No one has ever done that. You've always required, even if it's your parents who brought you up, like you never did anything on your own.
That's a question for both of you. How do you manage then your own psychological, emotional state in terms of going into coaching? So I think it probably relates to anyone who's working with people where there are some days that are better than others, and there's some days where things are going on in your life that are going to affect how you interact with those people. Do you have particular processes that you go through thinking about how you create the right mindset that you need before you go out to coach?
Golf and alcohol.
At the same time?
Preferably. No, seriously, golf is where I go out and think.
Yeah, okay.
It gives me time to just sort of do a bit of reflection. And, I don't mind playing with other people. I'm quite happy to go and play golf myself. It's something I've always done that helps me. I haven't been doing it enough lately just because the weather's crap and stuff like that. But, I'll quarantine 3 or 4 hours and just play 9 holes at Yarra Bend. And I come away just feeling, it's good physical activity, but just refreshed. And I try and do that once a week. It doesn't happen all the time. But that myself, I know when I'm yearning for golf, I realise I've got to go and do some thinking. Yeah. And that really helps me. Look, there are times where you're just so emotionally wrapped up in what's going on. It's really hard to pull yourself out of it. Really, really challenging.
I mentioned it makes you quite mindful of thinking about how your current psychological, emotional state impacts the group dynamics and their performance in real time.
Well, I've got a PhD student that's just finished, and she's done her PhD on coach identity and what goes into that. But then her next project is the impact of coach identity on athlete identity. And we've started sort of looking at that side of things. And when the coach is fully immersed and really understands and loves their sport, that seems to infect the athletes quite a bit.
They've got to replicate that similar mindset of like, as you want to continue to learn and grow as a coach, that's exactly what you want the athlete.
And it comes back to that notion of curiosity. If you're curious, and I think really good coaches are curious, they're just curious about lots of things, not just coaching. And you take that time to be curious about the lives of the athletes. Some of them don't want you to know about stuff, which is fine. But I think that just makes a huge difference. But it also means then when there's some shit going on in their lives and all of a sudden, because they know you're going to listen and be curious, you take on some of that load. And this is what Rowan Taylor was talking about in coaching. And it's well publicised, but he, what's her name, the breaststroker that he coached, won Olympic gold.
McKeown, is it McKeown?
No, a while back now. It'll come to me in a minute.
Is it Liesl Jones?
Yeah, Liesl Jones, yeah. So she wrote a book and about it, and I think he contributed a chapter or something like that, and he said that just broke him because it was so emotionally intense for him. And I was chatting to him, so, well, how does that now translate into the work? And he said, I have these really deep and honest conversations with the coaches, talking to them about, how do you handle the stress? Because, swimming is intense enough as it is because it's a very contained and constrained environment. and the challenges of getting athletes to get lane time and space in order to do the training that's one of the biggest bugbears of swimming coaches.
Yes, actually. Well, it's my biggest concern with coaching in general is having a safe and consistent environment to be able to coach.
Like physically safe, that is, yeah.
Well, we have an issue with our club, soccer.
Yeah.
There's just kids running, and I go nuts.
Yeah.
Like, I go nuts worrying about this stuff.
Yeah.
And, we've got some support, like the current president's pretty good with it, but they can't get rid of them at the moment. And it scares the crap out of me.
Yeah, sure.
And I'm always worried that someone's going to get hurt, kid's going to run across. I'm not worried about the kid getting hurt. I'm worried about my athletes.
Oh, yeah. I mean, just to deviate at top speed, you know what the injuries are going to be like. It's just catastrophic.
Them, like,
yeah,
oh my God,
catastrophic. Or even if they see a ball coming and they just dodge.
Yeah, and something happens, they trip over, they pull their ankle, strain something, whatever.
I'm just thinking just basic soft tissue injuries of changing direction at top speed, at 30 kilometres an hour. That in itself, an athlete can't do that.
How do you
especially in spikes where there's nothing in the heel.
How do you address belief in your athletes?
Unpack that question a bit more, because that's a pretty big one. Yeah?
It is a big one. Well, something that's quite evident to me, even just working clinically, let alone reading about athlete experiences, is their beliefs and perceptions of themselves, their ability to reach certain levels, is such a integral factor that determines their success and performance. You've obviously got quite a bit of experience and knowledge related to understanding psychology. Are there certain things that you look at or address and talk to your athletes to change that, if you think it's needed?
Yeah. Look, I do have some athletes who believe they're a hell of a lot better than what they actually are, which is fine. I think that's actually not a bad thing.
That's a better position than...
Yeah.
But probably also that depends then on how they actually respond to failure then as well.
Yes.
Let alone success.
Oh, look, and, if they haven't met a particular goal that they've set themselves or we've talked about and negotiated, so reaching that, and they haven't made it, we're both devastated, and it actually has a big impact on their confidence. So I think there's a real connection between what they believe they're capable of and then their confidence and capacity to actually get there is that's integral. And so having those conversations are quite challenging. I've got a young athlete and she's quite talented, and she's got all of these people in her ear, like she's 14, saying, "Oh, you're going to make the Olympics." And so she says to me, "Andrew, am I going to make the Olympics?" And I said, "I've got no idea. I've really got no idea."
Do you think it's a problem?
It's a massive problem.
Absolutely.
A massive problem in our sport.
Yeah.
People pumping up kids that they just need the time to develop.
Yeah.
Well, it's not their fault. They have ability, but people get excited, and I feel like particularly around talented athletes, and you've got to be really careful with the word talented. And I don't know if anyone who's read the work of, say, Carol Dweck, and the growth mindset stuff about telling kids that they're intelligent or smart or talented can often be a rod for their back for the future, because they will hang off that. And it's all about this idea of potential versus, realized performance. And you've got to be really careful with what gets said to these athletes and what the messaging is and who you have around them. And because it's very easy to start drinking your own bathwater. It is. No, it is.
That happens.
And often, actually, as the coach, sometimes you have to be the bad person. Like, I had an incident yesterday where a guy who's sort of on the fringe of being involved in athletics at a high level, and all of a sudden just wanted to talk to one of my athletes during the session. And I had to say to this athlete, "Look, I know that you're being nice, but can you please tell this guy to leave?" I was going to do what I normally would do, which would be like, "Hey, mate, can you fuck off?" Right? Because that's the way I tend to talk to people.
That's good.
But
I like it. I don't do it enough.
But like, you're in the middle of a training session. Could you imagine? And I always have this, and they actually wasn't that happy with me that I said it. But I always think about it like this. If you were an elite football athlete and you were in the middle of training and you walked out onto Punt Road as a member of the public to go talk to Dustin Martin, pretty quickly
you get gang tackled.
Yeah, by security, and you'd be booted out. Because people do go along to watch training sessions. But you can't go and interact with the players, and you wouldn't do it anyway because you would realize, this is a professional setting for them. It does frustrate me that we're in our setting because we obviously train at a public venue, which it's good that the public's there. They get to see, elite athletes training. I think it's quite nice for the general populace, but understand where you are. And even for the athletes, understand what you're doing.
Respect the boundaries.
Yeah.
I mean, even me, when I see those guys, I want to go and have a chat to them and just
say hello,
and say hello. But
you do know them quite well.
Yeah, that's right. I do now. But I'm just mindful. Am I impinging on what John's doing and that type of thing? So I always just pick my moments now just to say hi, and it's usually when they're having a rest between sets or whatever, just to have a quick chat, or once they've finished. But generally not when they're getting ready to get ready for their next repetition or whatever.
Yeah,
but it's knowing and understanding that. But very few people have that knowledge.
Well, obviously you do because you're involved in the coaching stuff. But yeah, so I think what you're saying, Jack, if we go back to the original question, the idea around that talent and understanding that and knowing what these people say this 14-year-old, your job often as the coach is to protect your environment, to try and keep it an environment that does foster their development. And sometimes it's saying things to them that maybe they don't like. Sometimes it's, as Andrew was saying, about being realistic about what their expectation is. So that's not always easy. And those require, at the end of the day, I think they just require lots of conversations that are open and honest and transparent. It's really awesome that Andrew is open enough to say to the athlete, well, I don't know if you're going to the Olympics. You're 14. A lot can happen between now and when you're going to be at your best. Like an example I would give is I've spoken to a number of high-level coaches recently in some of travels and some of the things we've done with Athletics Australia, and I don't think there's enough education going to athletes about what their process is going to be. Like in my mind, at least, if you're going to be a successful sprint athlete of Caucasian background, your best is going to be probably between the age of 26 and 32, right? Maybe even longer, but that's probably when you're going to start hitting your best. So why are we not setting up that athlete for that period rather than, they're 22 and they haven't made it? Like it's a terrible communication.
That's really bad.
Yeah, but it happens a lot.
Yeah.
And I think, unfortunately, particularly in Australia, I think because of sports, say like swimming, where success can come a lot earlier than that, we sometimes compare in our sport.
But we've got the system in swimming to enable that.
Yeah.
Whereas in athletics, we're always, and I had this exact conversation with one of my guys saying, how is it that Abby Steiner can run 28.3?
21.8.
21.8, sorry, 28.3.
Should be last.
She wouldn't even
That's
be
what
there.
I run for too.
I don't think so, Jack.
21.8, and she's 20 years old. And I said, well, she's probably come through a fairly rigorous high school system.
Yeah.
And once they're in college, they do concentrated training, but they also do winter competition as well as summer. Yeah. So they get the equivalent of our six-year development for us condensed into 3.
Probably even more than that, yeah.
And the level of competition every week that they have during those things is really, really high, whereas we've got a bit of club
lots of low-level stuff here.
That you think, I've got to show up to win points for the club. And
it keep you also a bit humble in that setting too, because if you're not always the one who's, the talented one who's always winning the races, it probably helps to create that better mindset for development long term.
Yeah,
that's probably where the issue arises. And like John and I talked about this recently in another podcast of talking about the hormetic response. So the adaptation process is typically not linear, and you may often have a negative response prior to getting that positive supercompensatory effect. And I often think about that too from a psychological or emotional standpoint, whether it's in high performance or a rehab setting.
Yep.
Do people's expectations meet reality? And often if they don't, there's going to be a point of discomfort that they have to experience, that their mindset or beliefs need to change.
Yep.
And part of that may be negative to begin with, where they go, I'll stuff you. I don't want to talk to you because you're putting me back in my place. But actually, that's what allows the development long term.
I think, especially in sports like events like sprinting, where you might get some momentum and you get this sort of linear thing, but that's very rare.
Yeah,
it's
and it's
extremely
usually
rare.
only a very short period of time.
It is, that's right. I mean, I looked at Hannah. And,
Hannah had that period, but this year's, I keep saying to people, and people probably think I'm bullshitting, but I'm not. This year, where she's really underperformed and had lots of life changes, had injuries, is the most important year of her career.
Absolutely.
Right? It could go either way, right? And I'm not saying that all of a sudden it's just magic, she's going to run faster. She might run worse. At the moment, I don't know, right? That comes down to both of us and our team getting it, right. But if we take the right steps and we're willing to be open and transparent, as I said, about what we're doing, I actually think this could be the catalyst for a lot of progression.
Yes.
Because what happened last year, where it was almost ridiculously simple of this linear progression,
it just seemed easy.
It's impossible, right?
To maintain at least.
It's impossible in terms of the fact that the probability of that happening in someone's career is so low, right? And I've had lots of conversations with her this year about this. She worked hard, right? But the outcomes occurring in that fashion doesn't happen very often. There's lots of people who work way harder than what she did and get zero improvement, or they go backwards, or they get injured, or they stay exactly the same. And it has nothing often to do, that linearity is not related to effort. People don't get that sometimes.
Well, it'll be interesting to see, it's interesting when I talk to her when she's in here, there's clearly been a change in her understanding of the psychology of her and how that's influenced her development over time. So,
and I think it was last Saturday or something, I just said, how's your mojo? She said, I just don't have it at the moment. I said, okay, well, that's something we're going to go looking for, right? And we were just having a bit of a joke about it. But it's the sort of thing that I think is, those sort of conversations around talking with athletes and really getting a sense of that. And Noel Donaldson, the coach of the Awesome Foursome, he was really, really good at, when they had their second go at winning the gold medal, which they did, he tells this story, and he'll tell it much better than me, of course, but pretty much they showed up, I think, 9 months out from the 1996 Olympics when they won their second gold medal. He said they were all just totally unfit and just not motivated. And he had this conversation and saying, well, what are the things, let's identify the things that you need to have in order to be race ready on the day at the Olympics. And so they came up with this thing, and they said they called it their bag of tricks. So they had to bring their bag of tricks to every training session, and it was sort of just a metaphor for making sure that they were eating well, they were sleeping well, they were flexible, and they'd been doing their treatment and all the recovery things. So that was that sort of process there that he started to instill in them and put the responsibility on them to actually look after those things, because it wasn't his job as a coach dealing with these high-functioning, high-performing athletes. It's their life, their body. If they want to be there and they want to win, to want to be in the boat to contend the final, it's really up to them.
You can't control all the factors.
No, that's right.
Yeah.
Well,
And
we spoke about this obviously when we spoke to Brady, and I don't know that maybe they're doing it as much in that setting, but one of the concepts I think about a lot is, how do you create opportunities for them to have to problem solve? And typically, sometimes maybe putting them in the deep end. And they may know you're doing it, they may not know you're doing it, which I think is probably sometimes more interesting for us. But it's potentially giving them opportunities to get development happening maybe quicker, because you put them in a very adverse situation.
To test to see whether they're doing the right things. Yeah.
Well, even, as I said, even from, as you mentioned before, Jack, like that psychological point of view. And it's silly things like, my athletes know what's on the program. But some days I'll turn up and just say, we're doing this. Oh, but that wasn't what was on the program.
I did that yesterday.
Yeah.
And some people do better with that than others.
Some people just go, oh, well, all right.
Yeah.
And then some people are like, no,
Lose
but
their shit.
yeah, but they're like, we were doing this. I prepared for this. And it's like, oh, well, you could get to a meet and it gets rained out and you're running tomorrow now, or they changed, like, for instance, a Diamond League was on last night, one of the big comps.
Yeah.
And there was a heat wave. So they shifted all the events. Some of the events were at nearly midnight.
Oh, right.
They were really late. They were like 11 o'clock at night sort of thing. It's like, if you're planning to run at 8 in the evening and all of a sudden you're running at 11, be prepared.
Yeah, with it.
Yeah.
Well, there's a great documentary around swimming leading up to Tokyo, and that's what Rowan Taylor did. Head coach of Swimming Australia. He basically would.
Was that when they turned up and then they just made him do all these time trials and races?
Yeah. So they thought they were coming in for an education session, or whatever. He said, "No, time trials now. Get ready."
Yeah, and they were just like, "All right."
Yeah.
Well, some of them were. I'm sure.
I caught the coaches off guard, going, and he said, "This is about making sure you are prepared and ready to go at a moment's notice because
things happen."
Yeah, that's right. So,
all right. I think we've just hit an hour and 25. So
it's pretty
that
good.
went quickly.
Indeed.
Andrew, thank you so much for your time, mate.
Pleasure.
Really appreciate it.
Enjoyable, as always, to talk about coaching with people who are into it. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I've got a lot out of it. Thank you.